So I think we'll try to go through some of the Q&A questions that haven't been answered. So the first one, it goes back from before noon. So Ayalon asked, the gold on the pip cards of the PMB deck is much brighter than on the trump and court cards, except for the added trumps where the gold is also very bright. How can this difference be explained? I didn't answer this before because is it PMB, Pierpont Morgan? I was a little unsure if it was Brera or Pierpont Morgan. So if Ayalon can.
Morgan Bergamo.
Bergamo. Okay, great. Pierpont Morgan Bergamo. Thank you.
Name some of tarot aficionados use in their forums.
Yeah, there's a lot more lingo to delve into. So I think Lydia, do you want to talk about that since you talked about the gold and the oro di meta?
Sure. Yeah. So I hope that that was the answer to that question was sort of covered in our conservation talk. But so that difference is that in the Morgan Carrara deck, the backgrounds are oro di meta, so they're a combination of silver and gold, which gives that different kind of cooler, grayer tone. Whereas the other two decks both have solid gold backgrounds, so much warmer, different color.
And Federica, what have you noticed any differences in the Brera cards that you've been looking at? Because they are very bright. The Pinacoteca di Brera, the Brambilla deck.
Yes, I mean, I've only noticed some differences visually just because I've only done video microscopy for now. And of course, just visual observation. But we are scheduling for September and October an XRF campaign, both spot analysis and also macro XRF. So hopefully that's going to give us some more information about the composition of the metal leaves.
Great. Look forward to going back to Italy for that, Federica.
I'm here waiting for you all.
Great. So Fortune Buchholz says, how are they able to use so many different materials and layers, including all the paper, glues, etc., while keeping it so thin? What was their technology? Thank you. Anybody want to tackle that? Thinness? Marie-France, Richard? Talk about the adhesives, the glues. I assume that they must have, I mean, the papers are very, very well mashed together. You can see the different layers, but one aspect that we didn't talk about very much is that the cards are actually, they're not flat, they're curved. And that's probably because of all the gold and pigment that's on the front of the cards. But do we think that, go ahead.
Frank, I wonder, as I've been thinking a lot about the paper and the direction of the paper, how it's used. I would love to know more about that. If I was able to see more how, if the grains were crossed or if the grains were all in the same direction, how does it affect how flat the card remains as it, as it ages? So I think there's a lot of things to try and figure out still in terms of. And we've talked about, Lydia, Frank and I have talked about trying to recreate a card to see if we can actually come to this, maybe not to the same level of craftsmanship, but at least just try all the steps that we think, like our assumptions on how the card is made, and to see how it works and test our assumptions by recreating a card. So hopefully we get to do that this next year.
Perhaps I can just add that I don't know if it will actually help to address this question, but we are looking toward trying to do computed tomography on the cards in order to potentially learn more about the papers and how they were all attached together. It may not be possible to get enough resolution to distinguish between individual layers, but some of our early attempts have at least suggested that it's worthwhile trying.
Same person asked, what tool was used to incise the figure lines, and was the burnishing stone amber or question mark? Anyone have any comments on that?
Well, I know Giannini talks about different kinds of stones you could use for burnishing, but also most notably talks about different kinds of animal teeth that you could use, and specifies like a dog or a wolf's, a meat-eating animal's tooth. But I have to go back and re-specify which particular kinds of smooth stones would be.
Yeah, Giannini was a great source for a lot of this stuff and for underdrawings and for just the creation of panel paintings and then the tarot cards themselves. So we use that as a source. Another question here is, did you determine what the binding media is?
I'm going to take that question. So we're working on it. We are doing some work on the Morgan and Carrara cards. We've used many different analytical techniques. I mean, actually mostly FTIR in different modes. So reflection, transreflection, or transmission FTIR upon removing some microscopic samples to get preliminary information about what the binding media might be. From the preliminary results that we've gotten so far, we're thinking that the paint might be made with mostly protein and polysaccharide-based media. The glazes are mostly based on polysaccharides, based on our preliminary results. And then, as we've mentioned earlier during our presentation, we removed some microscopic samples that we've sent out to the Art Institute of Chicago, and our colleague Clara Granzotto, who is probably in the audience right now, is about to analyze those samples using PyGCMS and mass spectrometry based proteomic techniques, basically to determine the exact composition of the binding media in both the paints and also the glazes that are used in the cards.
Clara says she's on it. So
Yes.
yeah, she's on the hunt. She's on the case. Thank you, Clara. Liam Moore says, I'm fascinated by the number of techniques used in making a single card. And that was definitely something that we were very drawn to. Do we think Bembo had a number of specialists in his workshop, or was he an expert in all of this? What do we think? Well, we know at least that there's like
just
two brothers. So
as
yeah,
an art
please.
historian, and say that whoever the artist, if it's Bembo or someone else, taking on a task of creating a deck or decks would have been quite aware of the special challenges and issues, namely that they were going to be handled a lot and shuffled and a lot of scraping. So he or the artist involved would have taken a lot of time and care and thought about the creation, knowing the special conditions, that this was not a fresco that was going to remain untouched, or a panel that was going to be relatively remain untouched. So I don't know if that really addresses the fact that there are so many different techniques going on. But I wanted to just toss in that this idea that he would have been very aware of the special challenges due to an art form that's going to be heavily handled.
With that in mind, we have a question. How time intensive was each card? And a follow-up to that was days, weeks, months, keeping in mind that there are 60, 70 cards in each deck. So I actually haven't thought about the amount of time that would have been put into this, but I don't know who has. I would also say I've been pretty influenced by a long time period, because we spent so much time investigating how all of these cards were made, and they're endlessly fascinating. So that it seems only right that they would have taken quite a long time to create. But I can't imagine that Visconti-Sforza or anyone else would have been all that patient for their deck of cards. But I don't know if anyone has an idea on that.
Well, just to comment, because this applies to just the production of codices in a workshop for illuminated manuscripts. Bembo, or whoever was in charge of them, would have had a workshop assembly drawn up so that, you know, somebody's pressing paper together to make cards. And once they're produced, then they go on to, you know, the artist who's going to then sketch, and then they go off to the specialist, the poor little hack who's the specialist in the gilding. So that there was an assembly line aspect to production of manuscripts that I think also applies to this kind of phenomenon, where various artisans who would be better at certain tasks than others would attack the challenge in an assembly line fashion and finish them quickly, more quickly than just like card by card by card.
We have another question saying, thank you, Roger. Has any isotopic study been done or is planned to be done to really date the cards? I feel like this is right in the scientist's wheelhouse.
We haven't done any dating of the cards here at Yale. While the amount of material that's required to do some sort of dating has certainly decreased over time, it still requires, you know, some reasonable amount of sample. And unlike certain objects, which can almost be self-sampling, there's no great place to get a lot of material for dating the paper, for instance. And then, of course, that will only give you an idea of the age when the tree or other material that it was made from, plant material, died. And plus, it doesn't give a particularly specific date. Back in the 15th century, it's going to be a date range of perhaps 100 years to have reasonable confidence. So while that would be interesting, I don't know if it would tell us a great deal more than what we already know from the internal clues, such as the coin that would be that's on the cards or things like that.
Yeah, I think there's more art historical evidence to date the cards than would be provided by taking a chunk and having it sampled.
There's a note here from Ross Caldwell saying that the workshop of Tarocchi and Ferrara in 1452 to 1454 took an average of 11 days to make painted decks. I don't know how many people were involved. Okay, so there's a paper question from Taro Goldenhill. Do I remember right? Was the dragon watermark present only in the PMB deck? Would different paper manufacturers use different symbols, or would various shops, say in Milan, have used the same or similar motif?
The PMB is the Pierpont Morgan, right? Is that
Pierpont
it?
Morgan, Bergamo. Yeah.
Okay. No, so it was on the Visconti di Modrone, the Yale deck, that we had the watermarks.
Yeah.
As far as I know, I don't, as far as I know, the little we saw of the Brera cards, there didn't seem to be any watermarks. And on the Morgan, Colleoni, Carrara cards, the painted backs make it really hard to see anything. And we really tried to find watermarks, but we weren't able to. In terms of paper manufacturers using different symbols, that's definitely possible. So in the watermarks that I found with the dragon, I only had locations and dates, but no reference to any possible paper maker. I'm still at the beginning of this research, so I still have a lot. I think I still have a lot to do. And I don't know enough about paper making in Northern Italy yet to be able to answer fully the question. Maybe in a year, I'll have more information. Unless somebody else has an idea or an answer.
So I have Rui Chen says, I have a similar question about dating. How many evidences help to date the cards in the 15th century? Does anyone want to touch on that a little bit more, or have we covered that?
I think we've pretty well covered that. I mean, it's style. It's relating potentially to the Bimbo workshop. Costume can be used very well and easily to help date the cards, as I sort of touched on in my talk. So these are traditional methods that do help us date.
And the coins and contemporary accounts as well that are used in art history. This is a good question. What could be a modern version of such an endeavor from the standpoint of finances and the amount of team management involved? We're very familiar with team management, there being 16 of us here, but could we compare it to something we know, like the making of Tesla, for example, these early Tesla? I know it's not a scientific question at all, but still, I think it gets to the heart of just like just the whole, like the massive, I mean, the endless complexity of the cards, I think, lends itself to perhaps a larger concept of the amount of work that went into it that I think we could be overstating. But does anyone have any comments on that? I would say that we don't really have at least that I'm aware of, an accounting of how much these cost, or we know that the oro de meta costs less than the gold leaf, and that may have been why it was used. We know that like lapis is more expensive than azurite and these sorts of general things, but I don't know. We don't have that I'm aware of. We don't have any sort of written proof of how much all of these things cost. So yeah, it is a 15th century Tesla, I would imagine. And we have another question. Do you plan to compare the Este cards with the Visconti cards? And my quick answer to that is, like, we will travel to see any tarot deck anywhere. So yes, but does anyone have any comment on the Este cards and the Visconti cards? Maybe Thierry.
I'll jump in. I'm saying that, yeah, I keep nudging Marie-France to say let's add the Este, because I showed 2 images of them. There are only 17 that survive. For me, I actually find them much more charming because they're very naive and they have a whole different sort of like palette there. I would love to do that. I don't know if it's going to reveal any true sort of like connections, rather than 2 different workshops, roughly contemporaneously, and a little bit about iconography. But as I mentioned before, I'm very, very happy that Yale, along with all the other partners, are able to take advantage of some of the Mary Carey funds that support research and collection development and investigation. And I think the future could also hold another segment of this research. Marie-France, I mean, but as we found, there's still years and years every time we discover something, there's 10 more projects to look into to really glean these amazing histories from these things. So, but the Estes are also, I mean, we know where they are, they're ready to go.
Yep.
The ST or ST arrogant cards are discussed in our catalogue, although they were not physically present. There were all 16 cards were reproduced as digital pictures, and they are part of our catalogue, I think, number 31 or something like that.
Yeah, I did want to say
the latest illuminated tarot cards we know of, and it probably was the end of it, because their style is much slower than the other illuminated tarot cards. They are assigned to Florence, obviously, as Ada Labriola, who was in charge of the Florence production, told us.
Yeah, I would like to encourage everyone to run out and purchase a copy of the catalog that the show that Thierry curated in Paris. It's got a lot of
Mhm.
the latest research, and it was a very nice exhibition. The Morgan lent 9 cards, I believe, to the exhibition. So we will put the information for the catalog in a later mailing, but I don't know if Thierry, if you have a link right now, but I would definitely encourage people to find a copy of that and to buy it. It's very useful. I think we are. Oh, let's see, one more. Let's see.
Well, I have a question, my own, if I can ask it. Can we say that the Visconti di Modrone painter used a narrow range of pigments compared to the Colleoni cards? According to what I have understood, the range of pigments used in the Colleoni cards seem to be much wider than for the Visconti di Modrone one.
Does anyone want to comment on that?
No answer.
Well, I would
Just very-
generally agree with that, which is, but there's a bit of a paradox in there, because I think that the Visconti di Modrone cards are much more individually made. Whereas I think one of the things that we will discuss further and have to put some more research into is that there's a more there's kind of a more of a mass manufacturing aspect to the Visconti-Sforza deck. And that's something that we're still exploring, but I think that I would agree with that theory, but that's the kind of paradox of it, because you do have I think a more straightforward specific palette for Modrone, and it's expanded quite a bit for the Visconti-Sforza Colleoni. But I think that the Visconti-Sforza Colleoni follow more of a specific sort of a pre-made pattern. So I think that is actually a very interesting avenue to research.
Okay, thank you.
And I think for at Yale, there's still a little bit of analysis we need to do. Like, we haven't completely finished the analysis of the pigments. So when we're done, we'll be able to better compare, I think, the two palettes. But yeah, I think in general, it seems like it's a little more simple palette than the Morgan Carrara cards.
Yeah.
So just a last couple items that came up here, and I think we may have covered this a little bit, but how does the cost of producing the tarot card decks compare to producing an illuminated book of hours, for example? Is that a reasonable comparison? And do you think they use presses at all to make the layers to combine to make their thinness? So I don't know if anyone wants to talk about tarot decks and illuminated book of hours cost. I mean, I would imagine at the very least that it would, well, first of all, there's a lot more parchment involved with illuminated book of hours, so you don't have that cost. And you don't have to pay a scribe. I don't know how much money scribes made at the time, but that's at least, you probably had, you don't have the scribe and you don't have to have the parchment. So I would imagine that actually paper is quite a cost-saving aspect of this. Anyone else like to comment on that?
It's a little apple and orange as you described, Frank, because the lack of vellum and the lack of a text. So yeah, it would be hard to come up with a comparison without having an archival record of a payment.
And I think it'll be the last question. Do we think presses were used to create the paper, to combine them?
Could instead of just backing into a corner with presses, can one just ask, were presses or perhaps heavy weights involved in the compression of the paper layers?
I think
Marie-France suggested, oh, go ahead, Marie-France.
I think it's possible, but I've noticed that we were looking at the various cards. I did notice, initially I thought, oh, these are really, really nicely flat. And then as the more cards we looked at, it was like, oh, look at all these bubbles, and like they're not completely flat. So there might be some amount of weight, but at the same time, I don't know if like just me by trying to make one supportive card the first time I tried, I didn't wet out my paper first and I applied my adhesive directly on and I got a ton of bubbles. And then the next time I tried again and humidified the paper first, put my glue on, slapped them on together, and then I got a really nice flat sheet. So, and I didn't use a lot of weight. So it's hard to say whether or not, like if you could see that the grain of the paper was like really, really pressed and flattened and you don't see any grain anymore, but that's not what we observe, I think, on the cards. I think the grain is not necessarily completely flattened. I mean, it's abraded, especially I think on the Yale cards, you can see that there's quite a bit of abrasion. But I don't know if we can tell. I don't know. What do you guys think, Lydia and Frank?
Well, I was just going to add to that we definitely see bubbles under the paper that's used as the backing layer, and that layer that the paper that comes around and forms the border around the front of the card. So it makes sense with that layer. We still don't know if that was applied to the back before painting occurred and then just kind of waited there until the painting was done and then those borders were formed. But it makes sense that if that layer was adhered last, you wouldn't be able to put weight on it after, after the paint application had already occurred. But again, like the dense layered structure makes it a little difficult to break apart, like to really assess what's happening in each stage of production.
Well, I think we have parallels in other cities like Ferrara, the archives of which were published in thick books in the 1990s, with many payments for playing cards, for pigments bought by the card makers there. And we also know of a press bought in 1436, so quite early, much before the printing press was invented. And although it was taken for a printing press, which was a mistake, I wrote an article to explain that it was a press for pressing the paper for the cards. And we can also find parallels in later printed cards, including what you call the wraparound, which in our jargon we call turnover edges, which was very traditional in Italian making of playing cards until the First World War. So we know that very early in the 15th century, this kind of turnover edges was already used. I think it needs a press to have all the layers of papers correctly glued one to each other. And this has been used by card makers for centuries, in Italy particularly, with these turnover edges.
Actually, I have a question, Thierry. Do you think that the cards were made one by one, or do you think that cards were made on larger sheets, like larger sheets glued together and then cut? Or are they already cut to size before they're stacked?
Well, for illuminated tarot cards, I can't say. I think they were made individually, and particularly because of this Italian techniques, which needs a back which is larger than the cards to turn over the edges. However, once the woodcut was introduced around 1400, and a real, how can I say, profession of card makers for popular cards were organized. I think that the idea was to have a larger production with using woodblock printing to have between 12 and 24 cards printed in one sheet, as we can see in the Carey sheet of tarot from your collection, from the Carey collection. It is just a fragment of a sheet, but we know of this, and very early in the 15th century, because the earliest date we know of such technique is 1418 in Palermo, where wood blocks for printing cards were there in the inventory of a deceased man who used to use it beforehand, so before 1418. And that is very interesting because in the same inventory, we find playing cards and what I think are poorly printed playing cards. There's a disformatorum in Latin from formare, which means printing, actually, from a forma, a woodblock, I would say. But here it's disformatorum, disformati in the nominative, which I understand as badly or poorly printed, but it's my own interpretation. But that's very early, 1418, for using wood blocks for printing playing cards.
So I'm just going to have, there's just one last question that we're going to answer here. Thank you for everyone who participated and joined in. Someone was mentioning shuffling of these cards. Are there any shuffle marks? These cards are so expensive, I suppose they were only used for display for whatever reason.
I was one who said shuffle because I was shuffling facsimiles, but I didn't mean that. I mean, I meant the cards to be somehow arranged in a randomized group and then distributed. So it's not like my uncle taught me how to shuffle cards. So somebody can help take that.
I should say that one aspect that I think that we didn't mention was that all of the Yale cards and the Morgan cards for sure have holes at the top, definitely at the top, and some of them at the top and bottom. So it does appear that someone somewhere displayed them, showed them around, basically pinned to a wall, pinned to something. So they all have pinholes in them, or thumbtacks in them, thumbtack holes.
What they used for playing was a question we were asked during our exhibition, and we tried to offer some solutions to these questions. I think the bamboo cards, the 3 sets we know are, were not used for playing. If I consider the Corleone cards particularly, I see that they are in a very good condition. Whereas the production from Florence, which we exhibited to, not only show some signs of wear, but most of them had numbers written on the top of some of the trumps, just to remind the people they obviously were, these numbers were obviously added afterward, perhaps decades later, but they are a sign that these cards were actually used for play, because it was the only way to really remember which trump was in which position in the hierarchy of the trumps. So it's some kind of evidence for using these cards for playing. Maybe it was so in Florence, but not in Milan, I don't know, but it's just a hypothesis. Of course, they use as prestige objects is obvious too.
Well, I think that sums up our question Q&A. I'd like to say thank you to all of my wonderful colleagues. Thank you to the Morgan Library Museum, the Art Conservation Center, Yale, for their financial support for sure, and for providing all the time for everyone to get together. all of our guest speakers. Thank you very much for joining. This has been a great project, and really looking forward to continuing more soon. The videos will be posted, will be edited and posted hopefully in the next couple months or so, and then we will move forward from there. You'll hear more about tarot from the Tarocchi team, for sure. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you.